Ladies and gentlemen, sport was supposed to be the great equalizer, but greed and money, because of professionalism, has poisoned, tainted and corrupted the spirit of sport. Team Ireland refused to stand for this. So what then is our stance? 3 points of setup. Firstly, we regret professionalisation, including things like salaries and benefits in kind. Second, we support sports clubs being run like charities. We still have ticket fees and we stand over them being quite cheap and all profits going in towards the upkeep of the club and youth development, as currently happens in amateur sports around the world. Thirdly, we think the comparative is an increase in uptake and interest in amateur sports, as I will explain in my second point. With that, 3 lines of attack from Team Ireland. Firstly, why professional sports are inherently pernicious and must be stopped. Secondly, why amateur sports get better on our side, and in our second speech, a point on the overall enjoyment of sport. With that, on to my first point, the pernicious practices of professionals. Professional sports have a huge profit incentive. Clubs and players want to make as much money as possible. Winning leagues give clubs huge cash prizes, and players that do better get increased salaries. Also, as a result, more fans migrate to the club, which means they get more money as a result. Let's walk through the machine of professional sports to lay bare the harms of this influence of greed and money. It starts off with recruitment. Sports clubs want to cast as wide a net as possible to drag as many youth players into their academies. They pay them small salaries to convince them that dropping out of school is worthwhile, and they also sell them images like the rich lifestyle of the top 1% of sports clubs, which are obviously very unrealistic. However, the reality is that most players don't make it. Professional sports is a zero-sum game. There's only 11 players starting for Man United. Clubs purposely attract far more players than they ever need because they can afford to, and because it's worth their while to have as big a pool of talent as possible. The harm here is that the majority of players in academies have dropped out of school, possibly gotten seriously injured, as is the case in UFC, which recruits huge amounts of vulnerable people from the favelas, which means that when they do fail, they don't have an education, which means they can't get a job to support themselves, and they're also possibly seriously injured. Also, independent of all that, they've just missed out on their childhood, which we think is sick in itself. It is clear that the machine that team opposition support is simply despicable. No thank you. On the comparative, there is less of an incentive for sports clubs to be as callous and as disregarding of the welfare of their players because they have less to gain as a result. They also just can't pay them the wage to drop out of school, which means it isn't worth that while. They can't convince them with the rich lifestyle of the top 1% because they're not played. No thank you. The impact here is more kids stay in school, don't suffer life-altering injuries, and get to enjoy their childhood. Team Ireland think this is very important. Secondly, even for the players that make it, it still harms them. One, they're often explicitly forced to do things like take steroids and supplements by club doctors because clubs want them to be as good as possible, but there's also just a personal incentive to do it, to succeed and to get a higher salary by transferring to another club. This often leads to serious health implications, like American footballers dying of heart failure at 50. Secondly, the players that make it are still overworked and under extreme pressure to perform when they vote no thank you. They're also out of a job if they want. Comparatively, clubs have less of a profit incentive to overwork players and to force them to do things like take steroids, and also players have another job, which means if they do fail, the impact on them is less, and they're also just less afraid of failure on a day-to-day life. We think this is a good thing. Thirdly, for the fans, clubs are incentivized to charge high ticket prices to make as much money as possible. This often means that local fans are no longer able to afford to see their team play. This looks like the disadvantaged people of Tottenham, one of the poorest areas in London, being unable to pay in to see their team because they are crowded out by richer fans from abroad that the club caters to. We think people have a fundamental right to see and engage with their local sports teams for this reason. Before we go on, I'll take one thing.
Yeah, uniquely with profit incentives, these companies are more like broadcasting to the mass public, so the mass public is easier to access with things like social media.
First of all, we think there's a unique value to going to games for local fans, and secondly, your point of information isn't true. Ireland's 2 biggest sports, hurling and Gaelic football, are broadcast all around Ireland and all around the world. They're both amateur. You can still broadcast amateur sports. I'll get to this in my second point, but that is not a reasonable comparison. Fourthly, behind closed doors, clubs have a profit incentive to engage in things like match fixing and bribery because there's more to gain from it, so it makes the risk of being caught and compromising your morality worthwhile. This destroys the fundamental spirit of sport and also deceives fans because sports are no longer paid. If the team in Japan want to talk about match fixing and things like amateur boxing, this is often because managers want their player to be able to go pro, so it's a function of the existence of professional sports. Fifthly, sponsorship. Pro clubs are often desperate to attract the biggest sponsors, which means they often turn to unsavory actors like autocratic regimes or ghost states. This leads to one, sport trolls. Like when the Saudi government sponsors clubs and enables those clubs to buy a bunch of players and win the league, the fans are more positively disposed to their funders and less aware and willing to call out the rampant abuse of like gays and women in Saudi Arabia. We think this is a very bad thing. Secondly, sports clubs can be explicitly used for crimes like money laundering. This looks like criminal gangs, like the Hutches and the Kinahans in Ireland, but also just around the world, using like boxing tournaments to wages and prize money to essentially like money launder and cover wash their criminal money. So sports are often used explicitly to commit crimes. On the comparative, clubs have less of an incentive to turn to massive and malicious sponsors. Even if they do, when they have less money, they're less able to sport trades and less able to money launder, so they can no longer like pay players or charge really high ticket prices. The conclusion of these five mechanisms is that we show you that professional sports is inherently sick. Even if amateur sports doesn't succeed, there is a unique good in just stopping professional sports as it is. With that though, on to my second point, that amateur sports get better on our side of the house. We think this is the most likely comparative. First of all, like people just love sports, right? They're fun. We like hitting round objects into or over nets. It just feels good to exercise. You make friends. It's great. This means that people are very likely to still play amateur sports. Also, like just look at the success of amateur sports all around the world. We think they're very likely to succeed because one, people can still donate. It becomes a philanthropic endeavor to donate to a club in the same way people donate to other institutions. Second of all, governments are likely to continue to fund it. Often sports are associated with culture. They're just a good way of keeping your citizens healthy. They're likely to continue the incentives they have to fund it. Thirdly, universities and schools still want to have sports because we care about their students, but it's also an additional push factor to draw more people in. And fourthly, people also could just like to play amateur sports for free, which means there isn't a massive amount of funding needed to get them off the ground. We think that, however, in the status quo, pro sports actually hinder the development and success of amateur sports. This is an important strategic function because it means Team Japan can't just point to the failures of amateur sports. The failures are as a function of the existence of professionals. Firstly, funding is often diverted to the top players in amateur clubs because amateur clubs want to have one of their players go professional. It gives them clout, which means that it gives them clout, and there's also a chance that player will come back and coach or donate. This means that the resources and coaching are not distributed equitably, which means most players on the team don't get a fair run out, they don't get the coaching they need, which means they don't enjoy it as much as a result of all the attention on by the top players. Secondly, independent of this, it just kills the enjoyment of amateur sport. When professional sport exists, there's the perception that unless you're a pro, you're a failure. People don't want to play amateur sports into their teens and adults because they're aware that people their same age are making lots of money. They feel like they're not good enough. People also don't watch it as a result because they perceive that if it's not making money, it mustn't be as good. Thirdly, there's just less amateur sports clubs kind of as a result of this. The impact here is that people enjoy amateur sports and play them less. For all these reasons, because we stop the sick machine of professional sports, I urge you to propose. Thank you.
In an increasingly isolated world that lives online, the importance of sports becomes increasingly apparent. I'm going to be pushing two main arguments. First on how we raise public opt-in, and then the second on mass-scale competitions. But before that, I want to characterize this debate. What does professionalization actually look like? And we say this business-led phenomenon probably means that these groups are going to be more profit incentivized. What this then means is that the structure within these corporations and these groups are going to be more top-down. And there's going to be things like sale of fan goods, for whether that be, for example, me buying a Red Bull F1 hat or my friend buying a Liverpool uniform. The counterfactual then that the proposition bench has to support is on more localized, small-scale sports teams without investors, funding, or likely products. The important thing to note here is that now the incentive skirts from wanting profit to actually winning. And this is because you're probably going to be representing your hometown or your school or whatever it may be, and therefore you inherently want to win insofar as a thing there exists no profit incentive. I'll take you later. With that then, extraneous rebuttals. Now the first thing they'll have you believe is, the recruitment is going to be bad because, and these massive sports groups are going to do this for two reasons. One, because they can afford to, and two, because it's better for them. This is all they told you about this argument. This is all the mechanization they give you. We still don't understand why, just because they afford to, there's this incentive to do so. We still don't understand why it's better for them. They need to mechanize that in their second speech. But also, secondly, even assuming that this analysis is true, we then question whether they concede that sports is going to be significantly less popular and there's going to be less opt-in in their world. Because insofar as this is not the case, there's likely to be opt-in to sports groups in either scenario. Secondly, they tell you, oh, people are going to take steroids. Insofar as there's going to be competitiveness in either scenario, but actually, as we tell you, increase in their world, there still exists incentive to do things like take steroids. But engaging to their mechanism on, like, I don't know, your boss forcing you to take steroids, we think that there's existing and also improving structural mechanisms to stop exploitation from happening. Third and finally, they tell you, oh, sponsors are going to be autocratic governments. Firstly, this is just ridiculous, right? They need to mechanize why this is, one, likely, and two, in the incentive of these groups to do so, insofar as they're likely to do things like face significant backlash to do so. But let's assume capacity here. Let's assume that random teams can just DM Saudi Arabia and ask them to sponsor you. In this scenario, why is this impact likely not symmetric? We say that this is symmetric because insofar as in their frame they'll tell you all of this money in their world can be used for things like development. We think that there's likely still exists incentive in their world to try and attract sponsors, which means that contacting Saudi Arabia's government to sponsor you is also symmetric. But the first argument then I want to push is on public opt-in. And the premise here is that on opposition there's likely to be a dwindling interest in sports. The reason here is twofold. The first is on social media's increasing prevalency. That is to say that, for example, my 10-year-old sister has a smartphone and watches YouTube, or my screen time is like 5 hours a day. What that then means is that there's a decreasing interest in sports. That is, insofar as sports and opting into sports is incredibly physically demanding, you need some sort of push you to opt in. The reason why then social media is the tipping point here is that it allows you to pursue your interest in a more easier and like a path of least resistance way. For example, like I sat and like played games for 8 hours a day. But also the second reason why there's a decreasing interest in sports is on Western nations and developing nations and their increased interest in pushing for things like sitting down and studying. This looks like, for example, my Japanese mom pushing for me to study for 12 hours a day. Why is this true? This is due to industrialization. Because in this age of industrialization, there's an increased interest and there's an increased focus on your mind and intellect rather than your body and strength. So there's this less capitalistic incentive for you to opt into sports. The second layer under this argument then is going to be on the comparative analysis. And we say that corporate incentives tend to be on mass marketing. Why is this true? Because there's this profit incentive and therefore incentive to advertise. This looks like, for example, me watching a 30-second ad about sporting, or for example, Qatar World Cup being advertised all around Japan. Or this also even looks like, for example, games like FIFA that is prevalent. This also looks like big sponsors in other industries, for example, like Red Bull, Ferrari, Haas, which are energy drink companies, car companies, oil companies, all of which sponsor, for example, Formula One teams. Now, the important note here to make is that even if you don't have a predisposed interest in sports, that you're still likely to be exposed to it significantly and uniquely our world. What is the impact? Why does this lead to opt-in then? Because this leads to a continuation effect, because the barrier to entry gets significantly lower insofar as you're exposed to it over and over again. Also note here the accumulative impact here on peer pressure. That is to say that insofar as my dad opted into sports, now I'm significantly more likely to opt into sports. Just because my friend opted into sports, now I'm more likely to opt into sports myself. Note that this mechanization also means that even if the original opt-in from the ads itself is significantly low, the snowballing effect is likely to be massive. The impact here is fourfold, and I'm just going to quickly cover it because my second will be extending upon it. The first is going to be an increased push for accountability and higher standards in sports. The second is on the economic impact. For example, Spain is significant. Part of Spain's economy is reliant on Real Madrid. Third is healthier for country, and fourth is healthier. Fourth is happier for the country. Before I move on, sure.
As for your first argument, kind of based on the fact that you can watch sports in order to join it, and then you say your dad and your friends are the reason why you play a sport. Is it your attention in your case?
No. our mechanization is that insofar as you're exposed to sports in one way or another, that you're more likely to opt in. It doesn't matter in what way you're exposed to sports. The reason why we gave you a lot of analysis is because in our world uniquely, there's a lot of ways in which you can get exposed to sports. Second argument on large-scale sporting events. First there, why do we uniquely have international sporting events? Or more interestingly, why do they not have international sporting events? 3 reasons. Firstly, on public interest from argument 1, and interest means demands, means competition, because investors and corporations want to capitalize. But secondly, the profit margin for international sporting events is likely massive and uniquely our world compared to small ones. That is to say that people pay more because there's more demand. And this is furthered by things like nationalism in competitions like the Olympics or the World Cup. I have friends who went all the way to the other side of the country to watch the Olympics. But so third and finally, there's an increase in investors in uniquely our world for 3 reasons. 1, because there's a guaranteed return due to a guaranteed fan base. Secondly, because it's easier to invest because we're significantly more reliable. That is to say that there's a top-down structure which increases accountability, which my second will also extend on. Then thirdly, because we're significantly more stable, insofar as professionalism literally entails things like hiring analysts. And they will likely do this because they have incentive to attract investors, as they proved to us. That means that due to the increase in investors, then there's likely to be 1, more money and therefore capacity to get more bigger sporting events, but also incentive because investors want profit. This is so important for 2 reasons, but the main one is on how it's better for developing nations. Because the majority of things like World Cups and Olympics are hosted in developing nations. 1, because the Olympics and like IOC, etc., have incentive to do this insofar as they don't want to look like a developed country-centric place. But also secondly, empirically speaking, this is true. What this then means is that there exists development because you create a lot of infrastructure, for example, in the process of hosting the Olympics, or because you get significantly economically boosted insofar as an increase in tourism patterns. But also, finally, we also think that even disregarding the developing nation, the economy improves in any way. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to stand on the opposition. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech.
There's a show within the MMA community called The Ultimate Fighter. It comes out of large amounts of scouting, which occurs in poor lower income areas, places like favelas in Brazil, whereby large amounts of children are brought in. What happens then is they're put into brutal gyms where they beat each other up, so they have the chance to get a low extension contract with little sustainability into the future, so they can use the punching bag to pad records. This is the sports apparatus we described to you in our first speech. Their response was, well, maybe more people will get off their ass and start playing sports instead of staying on the Xbox. This never weighed in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about amateur sports. Second, I'm going to talk about professional sports. My third argument will be integrated into amateur sports because it has additional benefits why they are good. Right, on to amateur sports. Before that, I just want to go straight into it. Their claim here is that people do not opt into sports that are outside of the house. The reason why is because there's a trend of it going down because of increased studying, video games, industrialization. Notice, all of these trends are quite symmetric and exist on both sides of the house, so there's little reason to believe there's a massive delta here, unless they reverse the Industrial Revolution or something. I don't know, but they're defending the status quo, so they can't. Notice the problem here is that it's twofold. 1, there's a flip of this. At the point where sports are more commercialized, there's more of an incentive to integrate them into entertainment, right? So, insofar as people have a natural proclivity to be lazy as they frame, you're more likely to sit down on your couch and play FIFA with your friends and then engage in sport in that way than you are to step up and go out into the field and play. If it is the case that you don't want to do that for a host of other reasons, such as wanting to spend more time at home being lazy, such as not wanting to take the physical strain. But secondly, notice, there are many other reasons why you want not to play sports. We gave most of them to you in our previous speech. I didn't think these would be contested, but sure, I'll defend them anyways. The idea that sports is incredibly fun. You can make loads of friends going out and playing them. There's low barriers to entry, right? It's easier to pick up a football than an Xbox, so it is like just trivially. So more poorer or lower income people can play. And also, notice it is just fun, right? Like the fact that you're able to be in a team dynamic, play against somebody else, and fulfill something which is very deeply ingrained. All of this is to say, I've given a flip of this on mitigation. Even if this isn't enough, there is a very marginal difference in the amount of people who play sport, so you must bear that in mind when you're weighing it against all the material we had. I don't even think that they win the amateur sport clash. What do we have to say? Firstly, we said that amateur sports are likely to be killed or hurt hard to a substantially great degree as a result of this. The reasons were twofold and not responded to. The first was a large amount of misallocation towards singular players. Notice what this means on the ground, right? If I am somebody who's in who's in a club inside of Spain, it means that every single person in the team has less of an ability to train after school with the top level coach because they're spending all the time with the most bright prospects. This means that it is worse for me because I'm less likely to develop as somebody who's developed my skills in football, no thank you, as somebody who's not as talented. And then it also means that I'm less likely to get, is unlikely, as per the massive amounts of competition which exists in sports, that the person who's receiving extra coaching actually makes it. Secondly, we say that people feel insufficient because others around them are making it professional. Notice that these are comparative reasons for why they make this worse, and I think that the negative, the loss of enjoyment for people who play sport weighs over the marginal chance that other people might pick it up. Secondly, I just want to point out our third argument on why sports and the viewership of the enjoyment of sports increases, for four reasons. Firstly, there's more competitiveness. The reason why is because currently there's a misallocation and distribution of players, because the wealthiest clubs can just pick up the ones who are the most talented. Now you're more likely to stay in your locality because there's no profit incentive to move. You have to pay your own way to go to a winning club, which means that sports are closer. Secondly, there's a greater degree of loyalty, because you can't be traded between different clubs because your manager doesn't have the ability to make those sorts of transactions, meaning that you're just staying with your teammates for longer, which makes you happier. Thirdly, there's more fan interaction. Notice that the amateur spirit, I guess is what this is called, that there's less of an expectation for you to be as brutally competitive to make money, so you can just go down to the clubhouse and have a drink with fans, and that means that you're going to make their life better because you can have life-changing moments with them, and also your life better because you're not as stressed. And fourthly, because there's less of a desensitization to brilliance, because every single time you see a messy TikTok, you're less likely to weight the actual good play which happens in other games as being as great. Whereas when you're just focused on your own locality, it is far likelier that you're going to enjoy that sort of sport more. Right, I'll take it.
Regarding your analysis on how you're going to focus on one player, are you claiming that to be more competitive and maybe get a star player to come in coach you later, that you're going to sacrifice competitiveness by not allocating resources to other players?
Yes, that was our claim, because then you have the speculative impact of them coming back and helping you through coaching and through sponsorship, the reasons we gave, not responding to. Right, I want to take out the big claim on professional sports being good, which is the idea of broadly sports courses. They call it profession, they call it large competitions, and the reason why these are bad are several fold. The first is because tournaments like the World Cup and the Olympic Games have to, one, build loads of non-sustainable infrastructure, right? Because you need to host more games than a city would normally have. And notice the reason why you're likely to host these sorts of tournaments in cities is because it's easier for fans to get to so you can make more money. But notice this means you have to get rid of a lot of existing infrastructure. For example, in Brazil, you have to get rid of favelas. In China, you needed to get rid of large apartment blocks in Beijing so you were able to build the new Olympic Stadium and expand it so that you could get like the largest crowd in history so the CCP could put in their marketing. Notice as a result of this then, you get many people thrown out of the streets as a result of these large tournaments. But also, third problem with this is notice that this is a massive capital cost to the host, because the IOC, which is the International Olympics Committee, does not fund the Olympic Games being set up. They put off all of the costs into the host nation, meaning that every single dollar, no thank you, that is going towards Usain Bolt winning a gold medal is a dollar which is not going towards your healthcare system, which is something we care more about. And fourthly, sports washing is massively higher as a result of this, because there's an incentive for bad actors to take care of these large international competitions. They say, why would I accept a sponsorship from Saudi Arabia? Why wouldn't I accept a sponsorship from Saudi Arabia? If it gives me more money so I can get more kids going into sports, great, but it's not good on a macro level, and the reason for this is, and also if I'm a private investor, I want to get more money in my pocket. The reason for this is because large actors want to use the glamour of different games to try to cover up for controversies. We literally saw this in the Qatar World Cup at the point where there were migrant workers dying in droves, but people weren't talking about that after the World Cup, they were talking about the success story of Messi. Right. Alright, I want to deal with our claims, which are not very well responded to, and do a little bit of rebuilding here. Only a little bit, so wasn't much said. Right, we said that this is terrible for players, and we said it's because they take performance-enhancing drugs. This is the only mechanism they respond to here. They say that you want to do this anyway because you want to win, but notice that the reason why it's a tipping point for you to put your health in jeopardy is because if you don't do that, you put your family's health in jeopardy by not being able to make money. And the point at which your life is completely tied to this sport, that was a rational trade-off. Whereas me wanting to kick a ball harder so that I can feel good at the end of the day is probably not going to make me, no thank you, take Trenbolone, which is going to make my heart stop by 40. Alright, what else do we have? Secondly, you said there were massively exploitative contracts because you're not literate in the ways in which, it's kind of what I alluded to in the intro. You're not literate in things like contract law, you don't have the ability to sign large lawyers to help you out. Thirdly, you said there's a a lack of long-term incentives to have like things like pension funds, because notice an athlete's only useful until they're like 35 and their body breaks down. Why are you going to allow them to live better into the future? Fourth thing is that injuries are massively put on by this, and that if you get an injury, your life is essentially over because you have to dedicate an enormous amount of time to go professional, because otherwise you will just lose out to others. And then we had other claims on why sports are worse for fans, about ticket pricing, about sports washing, about money laundering schemes which exist. I think that they said that this was that this was an assertion, this was bad, but notice it's really easy to do money laundering off of sports. The reason why is because it's all at the gate ticket sales in the vast majority of cases, which means that you're just better able to get away with hiding that flow of money. What is the implication of all of this then? The importance is that there are people who are dying of overdoses of terrible chemicals which are flowing through their body, whereas on their side of the house, maybe you get to build bad tournament infrastructure and you get more people wanting to play football, but not many more, maybe like 5 more. And I don't know why that's going to win in this round. The last thing I just want to deal with quickly is the framing thing. They say that, well, the incentive structure changes because you just want to win now instead of wanting to make loads of money on our side of the house, but you want to win on their side of the house because winning makes you money, and secondly, why is wanting to win matters, or win this debate.
I'm going to stick to that speech and call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to further the case of the Opposition side. Here.
Sorry, can I just have a second to like clear my nose? If I speak at this volume, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Side argument in this debate, sorry, it's in the shower. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Side argument in this debate is all bark and no bite. Because no matter how much you can add, like explain fancy ways and how like you're gonna get more fun on their side of the house, and how these individuals will be benefited because of things like loyalty and stuff like that, they need to mechanistically prove why this will happen. I think the fact that they didn't do that suggests that their entire case is thrown out the first speaker. And because our case is over, I think we deserve this debate. I'll talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, is amateur sports an actual legitimate delta in this debate? And secondly, on the manipulation of players. Under this manipulation of players, I'd like to extend on my extension on why player welfare will be protected more on our side of the house. With that being said, I'd like to move, but for that, I'd like to engage to the second speaker argument on why you get more enjoyment for sports. The first thing that they said in their second speaker was that you increase the enjoyment of sports because you decrease enjoyment of sports on our side of the house because you increase competitiveness. But I think more competitiveness is better on like a winning metric, because the fact is more competition probably means that you have better sports teams, probably means that you have better competitions on our side of the house, which fundamentally means that you're likely to get better sports competitions. You're likely to get better matches, which satisfies both the sports player and the fan. But the second thing that they talk about is about how, these people want to stick with loyalty, these people want to stick with their team members and etc. No, thank you. But if they are so incentivized with things like loyalty and sticking with their team members, I think you're likely to stick with their team members on our side, on both sides of the house as well. There's no incentive analysis as to on their side of the house. These individuals will stick with things profit incentives and etc. on their side. But the third thing I want to point out, they say is that you have more fan interaction. I think fan interaction is symmetric insofar as on both sides of the house, professionals and amateur sports team, I guess, will probably likely to have fan interaction at the point in which it makes them more popular with their fans. And if it makes them more popular with their fans, then obviously it increases their popularity, it increases sales, for instance, of the products of your merchandise, etc. That is why fan interaction is symmetric on their side of the house as well. With that being said, I'd like to move on to my first clash on which side is better for amateur teams as they clarify on their side. No, thank you. The major argument that we get from side proposition here is that amateur teams will actually increase, and this is beneficial because it increases the fun of sports for some reason. I have three major engagements here. Firstly, this is not about amateur sports. This debate is not about amateur sports because it's a retrospective motion, as we clarified in our first speaker. Proposition doesn't have the fiat in this debate to say why amateur sports will gain attention, will become better on their side of the house, because this is a retrospective motion. But the second thing I want to point out is that I don't get the delta. Because if you get happiness by kicking a ball around, why do you need funding to do so? Why do you need a lot of money in order to kick a ball around on their side of the house as well? I don't get the mechanization as to why you need more funding for amateur teams in order for these amateur teams to get more fun on their side of the house. But the third thing I want to point out is that even if we do take their absolute best case, we think that mechanisms that they talk about, like funding, is ultimately symmetric. This is because the reason why funding happens in the status quo, or at least on their side of the house, is because of the profit incentives to fund, to actually invest into things like sports companies. And we get this uniquely on our side of the house because you have more professionalization. What this means is that now you're gonna have a business model. You want to satisfy stakeholders. What that means is on our side of the house, you get far more funding at the point in which you professionalize this industry. What this means is that you get more funding on our side, and given their mechanism of funding apparently leads to happiness, we think that we get more happiness on their side of the house. We flip this argument. But notice that this debate is about professional sports and whether sports teams will look like Real Madrid or localized sales teams made of volunteers. This point is out of this debate. No, before I move on, yes.
We give you 3 reasons why we're likely to get funding into these amateur sports, and 2 reasons why professionalism hinders the ability of amateur sports. Even though it was retrospective, it was likelihood analysis, it was not an assertive frame, as you say.
Yeah, it's a retrospective debate, which means you have no fiat to explain how amateur sports will progress on your side of the house. But secondly, we told you that funding is contingent on professionalization in industries having wanting to satisfy stakeholders. So all of your analysis is not contingent. But the second, moving on to my second clash on which side is better for the manipulation of players. And notice that this is the major argument that they give from first. If I can disprove this argument, then we win this debate. So the first thing that they say out of this is that professional agencies are going to drag a lot of new players into sports, and this is ultimately bad. I have 3 major rebuttals. Firstly, the characterization of these players is going to look like minorities, disenfranchised individuals. This is because there's little price to actually recruit them on their side of the house. The implication of this clarification is that you're unlikely, is that these minorities and disenfranchised individuals on both sides of the house are unlikely to get a good job in the future. Then this is because of structural barriers, things like lack of education, things like, lack of funding for these minorities, which means that uniquely on our side of the house, we increase the ability for these minorities and disenfranchised individuals to actually access things like education, because when they become pro players, because when they actually become good at the sport, then they ultimately have enough money to go to university, they can get sponsorships into universities, which probably means that they get better on our side of the house. But the second thing I want to point out is that you're likely that the kids and the players that these corporations are going to pick on our side are likely have a very, very big chance to succeed.
This is because, like, ultimately, if you don't think that individual is gonna live up to your expectations, then I don't understand why there's an active incentive to invest into these individuals in the first place. At the point in which you're probably gonna invest like thousands and thousands, even millions of dollars on actually nurturing these individuals on our side of the house, presumably they're gonna become good sports players, presumably they're gonna become successful. But the third thing I want to know is that, like, as a pro, you're probably gonna get a lot of money. I don't understand why pension funds and etc. is very, very important on their side of the house. So, moving on. The second thing that they then talk about is like drugs and steroids and why this is bad. But I just want to note that they never explain mechanistically why drugs and steroids will happen on their side of the house. Presumably, incentives like winning a competition, winning the national tournament, still exist on their side of the house, which probably means that drugging your athletes, giving your kids steroids and etc., are still going to exist on both sides of the house. But this is where I'm going to run my extension on why on our side we uniquely get player welfare and why we uniquely protect player welfare. The thesis of this argument is that accountability is far better on our side. And this is for two major reasons. One, for big-scale sporting companies, professionalization makes more investment, advertising players, getting them on TV, and etc. That means that at the point in which you do things like give them drugs, give them steroids, you get a lot of backlash against these big companies from the general public. And this is because the population on our side cares more about these players at the point in which you get lots of media attention on them. Notice that this backlash is highly effective in regulating these sports companies because sports industries are reliant on actually having viewers, right? Because if, for instance, like a competition didn't have any viewers, didn't have any people who actively want to watch them, then where would they get the funds to actually host these competitions in the first place? But secondly, for small, medium sports competitions, players can just opt out because small, medium sports competitions don't have that much bargaining power. And here's why the bargaining power that players have is significantly higher compared to these companies. With professionalism, you can, there's a lot of opt-in from different sports firms. That means they have a lot of competition and a lot of option for professional players. That means that for these companies, these individuals are likely to have a lot of options in terms of whether or not they can opt into these firms. This is debate winning because you don't have massive media attention on their side, you don't have more competition on their side, but you still have the incentive to win a competition on their side. For all these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the speech.
Chair, I can't believe I'm going to have to do this. We're going to start with what no regrets motion means and what we're actually trying to do in this debate. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about do amateurs buy into sports, including our third argument, which is on like fan enjoyment and how you buy into like watching sports, and then our first argument, which is on playing them themselves, and then I'm going to talk about the clash over player welfare and like how professionalism is institutionally a bad structure. Note also, like at the top of this, they just completely dropped their economy point. I think that probably means they agree with our second speaker's responses to this analysis. It probably isn't that beneficial to the local economies. Right. What does a regrets motion mean? It means that like we look at what sports would look like if we didn't have professionalization. We are telling you that if sports was not professionalized, it would have been a lot better for the people who want to watch the sports and the people that play sports. This is not a square in the motion, it's not something that we fear. We just think this is the likelihood analysis as to why it's better. We give all the reasoning in our debates. This is our case. That we are in mind of the debate. Right, let's talk about do managers buy in, or do amateurs buy into sports like the general public. On fan enjoyment, we told you 4 things and they all really go unresponded to. Firstly, on competitiveness, they say it's better competition because it's professional. I'd say it's the exact opposite as per the fact that the teams with the most amount of investment have like just way better players. They can just buy all the good players and become unbelievable. When Man City plays Bournemouth, like we all know the outcome of that game, it's very unlikely that the outcome is going to be close. Note that when it's a local game and you don't have the incentive of money, then people probably just stay in their area. What does this mean? It means that there's not huge teams that have disproportionately good players on their side. It means that competitions overall are a lot closer, and it means that these games were probably more fair, and the excitement, which is the tension in seeing who wins, was probably a lot better. Secondly, on loyalty. They say this is irrelevant, but like I think it really is, in the point that individual loyalty to clubs is much better at the point where you can't just be bought by someone. I would note that yes, I care really well about Team Ireland, but if Team China comes along and offers me 20 grand to go sit on their development squad, but I think I know where I'm going. Loyalty narrative of the game. At the point where people feel like those around them are being loyal, they're more likely to get on with them, and there's better narratives in terms of social media and friendships on the team. But also note that like at the point where you're more loyal to your club, we think that you probably play, not only do you play better, but you care more about the team winning as a whole rather than you getting a highlights reel that shows you scoring really well and you get recruitment into academies. This loyalty was important to the actual quality of the game, both on an individual and a team level. But note also, in terms of the coaching structure, it means that people who play for the team didn't feel like they were constantly competing for the coach's attention and trying not to get the coach to trade them off. This meant they trusted more in their coaches and they played along with their coach's game plan. Thirdly, on fan interaction. Look, I think fan interaction is better at the point where you have an incentive to interact with people. You're doing it because you enjoy the sport, not because you're making money, and insofar as you do that, you're more likely to interact with fans. We think that like Messi doesn't really care if he's talking to people in the bar, he's getting 100 million or like 20 million every week. We think the local hero probably spends more time with those fans, and you have those life-changing moments more. Fourthly, you're not desensitized to the moments of greatness. This is like really what's crucial in terms of the number of people coming to watch this. Note the reason why a lot of people don't watch local games in the status quo is because you can see the best games ever on professionalized sports. Like this football has been ruined by Messi's hat-tricks. Like yes, they're impressive to watch, but no one wants to watch their local clubs. Because of all the reasons we give you, we tell you those games would actually be better to watch, but at the point where the alternative exists, you probably watch like the best one you can possibly access. So we think the game is better, but at least even if the game itself isn't better insofar as like maybe there's less dunks in the game, you perceive it like it's better when it's no longer compared to like NBA dunks all the time. That one dunk is better than seeing 25 dunks because you enjoy it more. That was very confusing, but it does make sense. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, once you concede that more audience is going to be polarized insofar as you watch bad games, then isn't it likely that the existence of these high-quality sporting events, even if it means there's local imbalances, is likely to encourage more audience to watch good games, therefore opting into sports?
Like, this was the whole confusing thing, I'll explain it again. They're not bad games when you don't know what a really great game looks like. That's the argument here. And so far as like all local games are probably around a relative level and the whole sport develops at the same level at the point where it's amateur, we think there's not this huge difference between professional and amateurs and you therefore can enjoy more games. Okay, that was why those people were going to still enjoy watching sports. We think you probably get that enjoyment and it's even better on our side of the house. This was like a benefit on our side. Secondly, why do you actually play themselves? Note they like only give one metric as to why you wouldn't play because there's no professional sports and that's social media, but like I would argue you probably still have your local hero on social media, the amateur teams still have social media, so that probably is symmetric on both sides. But also note they don't respond to any of our other reasoning, such as like exercise releases dopamine, community, government like incentive to keep their school healthy, so they probably invest in sports or like their people healthy. Schools and universities probably have sports because it's something that attracts you to a school. For these reasons, you're probably likely to play sports irrespective of this existing, but we think you actually play even at best we're symmetric in terms of people playing sports and society being healthy at worst, but like at best what happens is more funding is diverted to the player, like to all levels of competition rather than those clubs investing specifically in one player in the hopes they come back and coach or in the hopes that they get recruited. Also, like at the point where there's like some sort of monetary incentive on like League One in any country, then the clubs are incentivized to put all their money into those. Note this is specifically important for like the women's game, which likely doesn't, like you're never likely to invest in your best female athlete because at the point where like their number one female athlete is paid less than the weekly salary of the number one male athlete, they don't get any attention. This equalizes the game far more for amateurs. Okay. At the end of this, I think it's probably likely that like people play the same amount, if not, we enjoy it more. But let's say we take them at their very best and say that amateurs are the exact same. Why do we win on professionalism? Let's talk about recruitment. They say that recruitment's probably the same, but it's not. Profit is a unique incentive to having you recruit loads of people, because the point where you can make millions and like hundreds of millions off Mbappe, you will probably pay 100 quid to 100 close to Mbappe's and sack off 99 of them. At that point, because there's such a big profit incentive, that does mean taking players, giving them forcing them to give up their education, putting them in risk of injuries, giving up their childhood, and most of them will never make it to that level. Note that because even if you say that one person makes it so it's okay, we think those 99 people who don't make it have given up far more opportunities, and they're this is even worse for disenfranchised people because if 99 Brazilians in favelas now couldn't develop any other skills, it's probably far worse for them. And also they feel worse about themselves insofar as you gave them a hope that they were going to make it as a professional, and now they have the even worse feeling that they didn't make it. At least on our side, that guilt and that feeling of failure doesn't exist for them on an emotional level. Secondly, on steroids. Note steroids use is just way greater because of the profit incentive. Why is this true? Because firstly, they just don't have the capital as a charity to invest in steroid development. While testing exists, the billions of dollar industry that is sports is always ahead in terms of steroids, and insofar as they can make millions off winning one extra game and getting in more fans and buying the shirts of their best player, we think that they probably just continue to develop steroids ahead of testing, and this means that you probably are forced into taking strong into taking steroids. But secondly, the motivation is just different, right? Because insofar as your income is completely reliant on these clubs, you probably are going to take steroids, but when you're working a normal job and playing for fun, you probably don't want to risk having a heart attack. And also, you don't have the confidentiality clause that you feel like held to that would probably be in your sporting contract. Finally, just on motivation of the coaches themselves, no coaches care more about stats and showing that their team wins to continue having their own job and career in place, whereas volunteers probably care more about players. They don't have so much money and income tied to the game themselves. This means that they're probably not going to force them into steroid use. No, we are literally talking about people having their dreams crushed, being left without a childhood, injuries, and being preyed upon by billionaires who make money off of sports. We're talking about people who take steroids and die really early of heart attacks. We're talking about people having no future sustainability because most sports aren't soccer, and most people play until they're 30 and they're left with nothing. The average pro hockey player can't have a career now because the culture of professionalism has said that she must be a professional on a 20 grand salary, and at 30 she's left on that 20 grand salary when she could be on 50k. Never prior to propose.
Three issues I'm going to talk about in this speech. Firstly, on sporting events and stimulus economy and why that was the winning aspect of our debate. Secondly, from Alton and why that's far more likely to happen on our side, engaging with their second point on amateur sports. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about welfare of sports players and why that exists significantly more on our side of the house. But before that, just a quick note on what this debate is actually about. And as we continuously push to you here, this is not about amateur sports. They say they have mechanisms, but there was literally no mechanism given for first, and we literally contested that and they gave no analysis. But we told you reasons as to why this is unlikely to be about amateur sports, about people playing in elementary school or people playing just outside of their profession for some kind of for some kind of pleasure for their after school time or something like that. This is because that has literally no delta, right? That's likely to exist symmetrically insofar as your inherent desire to want entertainment exists on either side. Therefore, you're likely to play soccer with your teammates after a debate on either side. So therefore, the extent of the amateur sports argument is extremely minimal from their side of the house. What I think is more important is things like professional sports that is able to contribute millions and billions of dollars into the economy every single year. First, what is the characteristic of localized and small-scale teams? So, which is a counterfactual that they have to support. Now, Prop 3 claims here that coaches don't exist for these teams, and therefore there's no enforcement mechanism to take things like drugs. But that's just not true, right? Insofar as you're a sports team, it's very likely that you want to employ a coach so you can become better as a sports team. Therefore, we think that their characterization is just largely false, and this undermines their case essentially. With that, sure.
When a coach has no profit incentive to compromise their morality and the welfare of their players, they're less likely to force them to take steroids.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to engage that later in my third class, so please listen to that carefully. Now, first class and the most important class, on sporting events and stimulus of economy. Now, what essentially our argument here was that sporting events like Olympics and those big-scale sporting events that is able to contribute billions into the economy uniquely only happen on our side of the house. And they do not engage this premise. They agree that this actually happens on our side, and this doesn't happen on their side. I'm going to prove to you why that's a strategic mistake from their side later down in this class. But basically, their engagement to why the sporting events happening is bad is to say that this gets rid of existing infrastructure. Two responses here. Firstly, let me note the strategic implication of their response. Because they only review with the example of Rio de Janeiro without any mechanistic reason as to why this universally applies in most instances. So therefore, we can just counter-assert that Brazil was a success case because it actually led to economic development of locals on the ground. Therefore, we think that insofar as their only analysis as to why this is harmful as examples, we can just counter-assert. But secondly, we're actually going to mechanistically prove to you why this actually leads to better outcomes. This is because accountability exists, and this is for three reasons. Firstly, because even if those precedents existed of some kind of harm happening to the locals on the ground, these precedents mean that there's further accountability for nations that are hosting it in the future. But secondly, because of things like IOC intervention. IOC is a Western nation that cares a lot about reputation. They're very likely to intervene in the process of this sporting event. But thirdly, because of huge citizen backlash, even if they're developing nations, right? And to clarify, the reason why this is likely to be extremely probable that citizen backlash plays a big part in government's calculus is because IOC only has sporting games only in democratic nations. That is the uniqueness of IOC. Therefore, it's very likely that citizen backlash is likely to play a part in big calculus for the government. Therefore, we think that it's highly unlikely that this turns into bad outcomes. This is why, in Brazil, eminent domain happened, but that actually led to these people placed in better circumstances. With that, I'm going to move. With that, the reason why this is an extremely important argument, that proving that international events happen on our side of the house was essentially really important, is because this is a unique way in which things like stadiums get built, things like roads get built in developing nations. They do not contest this way that we gave you all the way from first. Therefore, we think that by the nature of the amount of vulnerable people affected by this, we think that even if, for example, some local people from Ireland are polarized from sports, or even if some sports players are drugs, we think that this is a big impact that millions of people that are struggling in developing nations get infrastructure that they need. With that, let's move on to the second in clash about often is far more likely to happen on our side of the house. This is going to continuously engage their second argument on amateur sport and why that decreases often on their side of the house. We told you an argument that by market strategy, these people do things like FIFA, these corporations have active incentive to have things like advertising to increase exposure. We told you that inherently within the status quo, there exists an organic trend to stray away from sports, and therefore this is the only countering mechanism to let people stay in sports. There's literally zero engagement coming from their side of the house. They only push their points. So let me engage with their points then, with that actually established. Firstly, they say sponsorship with Saudi Arabia happens. They have 4 arguments. Firstly, they say sports sponsorship with Saudi Arabia happens. 2 responses here. A, these are predominantly likely that clubs from the West, that are happening in the status quo, insofar as Saudi Arabia is a really hot nation. They inherently don't have a really strong sport team like soccer team. Therefore, insofar as we're talking about clubs from the West, it's very likely that their fan base and their investors are the one from the West as well. Therefore, it's very unlikely that sponsorship with Saudi Arabia gets taken to begin with. But secondly, no thank you. Even if they take sponsorship from Saudi Arabia, I just don't see the harm of this. This is because by the nature that you're a Western sports team, you're likely to operate in Western sports grounds, and therefore you're likely to be accustomed to Western laws. Therefore, it's very unlikely that they'll now have these women's segregation policies from their teams. They just have to clarify what the extent of their impact is. Secondly, let's move on to spirit of sports, which is a weird argument given from their first. They say that there's going to be imbalance in attention towards financial allocation within amateur teams, so therefore this kind of leads spirit of sports being violated. I have 2 responses. Firstly, why is it just bad, right? If you get higher quality sports teams competing in higher quality sports, why is that bad? And here's why I actually reframe what spirits of sport actually is. Why do you actually enjoy sports to begin with? Why do you enjoy commercial sport? This is because you're constantly amazed by the human extent of what humans are able to do. This is because you're astonished by the goal that Messi is able to do, right? Insofar as they say that spirit of sports is about equality and all of that, we think that you can just get that spirit of sport fulfilled by, for example, watching your children play out in the fields, right? That's probably likely to be equal. So therefore, the uniqueness of commercialized sport is that you're able to see the uniqueness of human extent, and therefore we think that spirit of sports actually lays on our side of the house. Secondly, I'm going to flip this argument because they concede that it's going to be low level in P2 and P3. Therefore, what this actually means is that there's going to be more audience polarized on their side of the house per given their mechanism that bad games polarize more people. Their response is to say people are never going to know what's high quality, but presumably, if you know that your children are capable of playing this amount of to the extent of this much, or even without training, you're able to have things like goals, be kicked from 50 meters away from the goal. It's very likely that you know what human extent is, so therefore the capacity for you to be amazed and steps into the sport actually decreases on their side of the house, insofar as it becomes lower quality. Let's finally then engage on their field about sports players. And the thing here that I want to point out is their impacts are just over-assertive, lack of education and overwork. Education, there's mandatory education, right? What's their impacts? Secondly, on overwork, it's likely to be worse insofar as you're pursuing 2 professions at the same time. But they say in DPM that players are unlikely to take hormones because they care about your family. But this is completely symmetric. You care about your family on either side. What likely gives you then the unique calculus for you to take that medicine is because if you win against a city that's next to you that you've been losing for a continuous 4 years, you're likely to be glamorized as a local hero. Therefore, even if you care about your family or your job, you're more likely to give in to the external pressure. This is because even if they're amateur, the characterization coming from their side is that they're so passionate that they sacrifice precious weekends that they could have spent with their families on things like playing these localized sports. Therefore, we think that this incentive exists symmetrically on their side of the house. What actually changes is corporates, right? Corporates care about profits. Corporates care about public perception. So we're going to instill countermeasures to ensure that druggings don't happen because it looks really bad for them in terms of net perceptions. But finally, there exist things like Western laws. For all of those reasons, we think that sports players are also better on our side. Practical goals.
I'd like to give the speech.
I'll make this very, very clear from the get-go. Professionalization of grassroots sports hasn't happened in the status quo, therefore it is entirely symmetric insofar as it's a regrets motion. Now you shake your head, but if you want to assert that there exists a professionalization of grassroots sports in the status quo, then you had to have explained it earlier. Reply is far too late for this. I'm going to clarify this very, very messy debate, because government seems to believe and tries to engage to basically every single mechanization we give by giving you one-liners. Here's what we do on our side. We give you 4 things. Firstly, we completely decimate their point on amateur sports. Secondly, we prove to you that opt-in in sports lowers and this is significant. Thirdly, we prove to you that international sporting events save developing nations. And fourthly, we protect the welfare of players. Let's go one by one. Firstly, on amateur sports. Now, the first question I want to answer is, do amateur sports even exist in their world? Because they seem to be unsure about this. It's really unclear because on one hand they tell you, oh, they're better in that regard, but then they also tell you, oh, bigger events are ruined. But assume they're ruined, then why would people opt into watching these big events? Their analysis is, oh, but people don't know what good events, good sporting events looks like. And this is really, really unintuitive. We can really just prove to you this by intuition. Would an 11-0 game be good sports to you? Would Messi scoring 5 goals in one game be good sports to you? It's very, very objective. People can still tell what good sports is. But also, secondly, they tell you in amateur sports, oh, there's going to be an imbalance in attention. And we already tell you that the spirit of sports is in quality. We improve this. But also, we also largely flip all of this analysis by talking about polarization, as Narukami told you. But finally, the only reason why amateur sports seems to be better in our world is, oh, but increase in loans, and the incentive here apparently is on fun and dopamine. But we think this is largely symmetric insofar as like mothers and teachers, as they characterize, have an incentive to make sure their kids can get this dopamine rush, can go out and do sports. And if you want millionaires to invest in their world, you need to prove the altruistic incentives of these millionaires. Second, let's talk about opt-in, and we basically told you, oh, phones and industrialization means people are less interested. We proved to you the unique tipping point is on exposure, and we told you that this is a snowball. The response here came in literally nothing. This alone wins us this debate, as Narukami proved to you. Third, on international sporting events, we gave you 3 mechanisms: public interest, larger profit margins, and increased capacity and incentive due to investors. Now, their response is, oh, but Rio de Janeiro. Oh, but China. Now, this is very, very simply an assertion, and Narukami gives you a counter-assertion that largely deals with this, but also secondly tells you on backlash and accountability and how we take this. And we proved to you that this is important because this is a very, very unique way in which infrastructure development can be built, can be done in developing countries. We tell you that this can only happen in our world. This alone caters to the most vulnerable individuals and caters to the most individuals. That is why we take this debate. Finally, I'm going to spend the last minute on the welfare of a player. Here's what opposition tells you. The first 2 things they tell you is, 1, that the hiring process is likely to be bad because you're going to hire 100 people and then only use 2. And the incentive they give you here is on 1 because you can, and 2 because it's good. But also, secondly, they tell you on steroids, and they tell you this is likely because 1, you have an incentive to do so, and 2, because you're forced to do so. And the simple one-line response we can give you here is big corporations have accountability measures. That is to say that, for example, big corporations have to guarantee social security, unlike how they have to in volunteers. Big corporations have top-down measures, which means that you can control what sort of pressure from bosses occurs. We tell you all of this from our work we get, they simply have to prove why these sort of accountability measures is not enough to counteract all of this incentive that they tell you. But also, finally, quickly on autocratic governments. This is just one, intuitively sounds ridiculous, but also Narukami gives you a lot of structured analysis as to why this is unlikely. 1, because you're unlikely to take these sponsorship, but also 2, because you're going to have to still follow Western regulations, so even taking autocratic governments to the nations is still not at all negative. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to stand on the opposition. Thank you.
Team Japan say that we responded with one-liners, but their biggest problem is they usually responded with no-liners. This was why they were going to lose this round. Firstly, I want to talk about amateurism, a clash where we had 6 pieces of material. We said firstly, or 5 pieces. First, there was less reallocation of resources towards places where it wasn't beneficial on our side of the house, because we don't want to promote just one athlete. Second, because there's less pain when those ahead of you get into the professional ranks. Third, there's increased competitiveness. Fourth, more long-term commitments to clubs. And fifth, greater interaction with fans. To all of this, they had one response, which was to say that which is that pro sports is more enjoyable because it sees the extent of human ability. But we also said that the reason why amateur sport likes to be better is because people are more evenly matched. I don't know why it is good for me to see Messi score 5 goals and win 5-0, but I can see a 1 or 2-1 local derby when all of the clubs aren't just buying up the best players. We said this was far more intuitive. Also notice this response did not deal with the majority of our material. Secondly, I just want to notice here, they dropped their first arguments into a reply. It literally just did not come up in the debate, and then when it comes back in a reply, they stand up and say, we never responded to it. We gave 2 responses. Firstly, do we think that entertainment and sports gets intertwined? So this means that people don't actually latch onto sport, they just do sports entertainment. Secondly, that there's many other reasons why you want to play sport. They don't engage with either of these, they just assert they never existed, because they didn't track them. Right, on to what did Japan actually drop as well. They dropped their second argument until they brought it back in third. What they said here is that they tried to make this their path to victory, was to say that, well, international sporting events are really great, and that we never gave a reason why they were bad beyond pointing to the example of Brazil. This was just not true, right? We said the reason why they were structurally bad is because you have to put them in cities. The reason for that is because you get the most fans. The reason why that was important is because cities are based on urban sprawl, and you need to remove existing infrastructure to build stadiums. Because most cities in status quo do not have 10 different football stadiums. They'll make absolutely no sense. And also they say this infrastructure is cross-transferable. Try telling a homeless man he wants to sleep in a stadium now, right? It's very cold, there's no roof. Right, that's the problem. So, why is this really important? We flip this argument and we actively show why there's a massive harm here. So, even if we agree with them that amateurism completely falls on the ground, there's no delta here. What we would say is that poor Chinese and Brazilian people being moved out of their homes and put out of the streets is way more important than any benefit they get about somebody wanting to pick up a football because they've seen FIFA as a video game as opposed to just wanting to keep playing FIFA. So this was a massive impact. Right, what do we also have under this clash on how sports that works? We also said there's massive amounts of sports washing, which they didn't respond to. They just said there's no incentive for you to accept sports washing. We told you that you want to get money and that you want to also project your image. Now, the implication of this, very importantly, is that when I think of Qatar, well, actually, I think of Team Qatar, they're very nice. But apart from that, if I was a football fan, I might think of the World Cup and how fun that was, as opposed to thinking of all the slave labour which built the seat that I'm sitting on. And that is incredibly bad, as that cognitive dissonance stops you from holding people to account, shuts down dialogue with others when people are talking about these sorts of negative nations, which have been empirically the places which have held the most games. For example, Russia hold the Winter Olympics quite regularly, right? And look what they're doing right now in Ukraine. What we point out then is that we have massive tangible harms, which were not just harms independent in this debate, were also flips of their arguments, which meant that they didn't access their benefits. But outside of this, we have other material on how how the current system which brings somebody from being a child up to being a professional athlete is massively bad because of 4 reasons why it's going to be bad inside of these systems, because you're forced to take steroids, because you're constantly overworked and weren't able to see others, you weren't able to experience your childhood, and then you're likely to fail because there was loads and loads of competition. Notice then that what you have to weigh at the end of this debate. Amateurism can wash. We don't think it does for all the reasons I gave at the beginning. Also, even if our other arguments on how the sports pathway is bad is symmetric for some reason, because they say that we don't have fiat because it's a regrets motion, then just flipping their arguments is enough to win the round. And also, this is not how a regrets motion works. We gave you 3 reasons why we're going to get funding into these amateur sports on our side of the house, and then all the reasons I gave at the beginning why amateur sports are incredibly good on our side. So at the end, they've essentially tried to counter-assert with equal responses. I think you've tracked this. I think we'll win. Very proud to propose.
I think all the speakers for an enjoyable debate. If we shake hands, Rafael, and if everyone